I am the Maven of the Eventide and welcome to Vampire Reviews! Come in! I always say that just in case it's a vampire. It never is. So, yeah, that was The Neighbors, again. Apparently I'm bringing the property value down or something, and they want me to keep the curtains closed. Well, joke's on them. I like it in the dark anyway. I don't need moonlight to read my book. I have candles. See? They're inside of little skulls. Oh! John Lindqvist's 2004 debut novel, Let the Right One In, or as it's called in its original language, Let the Right Come In. It's okay. My grandma was half Swedish chef. Is considered the best vampire novel of the 21st century. You know, so far. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to be critical about. I first read it about 8 years ago and it blew me away then, but I've got some years of vampire scholarship under my corset now, and I've got some nits to pick alongside the praise. It's been adapted into 2 films, 2 stage plays, a comic book, and a TV series is supposedly in the works. You may be familiar with the 2008 Swedish film, which received numerous international awards, critical and audience acclaim. But if you're American, you might be more familiar with the 2010 Hollywood remake called Let Me In. The remake used the same exact script as the Swedish film, but did change a couple things here and there. It's less artsy, gorier, faster paced, and besides changing their names, considerably simplifies the characters and story. This doesn't make it bad, just more American, and kind of unnecessary. But it did bring the story to a wider audience, so we'll take it. Except for a couple weird things the American film added, both movies stick faithfully to the novel, with scenes lifted directly from the text. The screenplay both used was written by Lindqvist himself. However, this is a big book, so the script cuts out a lot. A lot. It's understandable, but a shame because some of the best stuff in the book didn't make it into the movies. Though it's considered a hybrid novel because of the horror element, this is literary fiction. But you know what that means, right? We're allowed to like it. Most vampire novels these days are exclusively genre fiction, that is, sci-fi, fantasy, mystery, romance, you know, things that we're supposed to be kind of ashamed for liking because they're not true literature. Literary fiction is the Oscar bait of the book world, often lacking in plot, but deep, theme-driven, with profound messages about humanity. Lindqvist's writing often centers around people who don't take themselves or life too seriously until they're forced to by love or fear, or usually both. And this novel is no exception, focusing on the darker side of humanity, heavy issues such as existential anxiety, social isolation, fatherlessness, neglect, divorce, depression, alcoholism, school bullying, rejection of religion, gender identity, homophobia, pedophilia, genital mutilation, self-mutilation, murder. But if I'm making it sound pretentious and preachy, it's not. This is a really good book. Like, can't put it down, keep you up all night, give you awesome nightmares good. And sometimes funny. Lindqvist has one wry sense of humor, but it's not perfect. Some parts seem like they could be punchlines in a stand-up routine about the insufferable cliché of the male novelist. For instance, one of the very few female characters in the book is going through menopause, and she tells a man she's sad because it makes her feel like less of a woman. But then, he validates her womanness by having sex with her. But my biggest criticism of the novel actually has to do with the vampire. There are several vampires in the book, but the central character is Eli, a child vampire. Eli is played by female actors in the films, and most of the characters think she's a girl, but she's not.
Oscar, jag är ingen flicka. You're not a girl? No. What are you? I'm nothing.
Not a girl because she's a vampire. Centuries old, neither human nor young, so girl is technically incorrect. But she's also not female. The original Swedish text avoids using any gendered pronouns for Eli in all passages from her point of view and anyone who knows her truth before it's revealed to the reader, but the English translation uses female pronouns, so I'm going to do the same. If she's not female, is she male? Is she non-binary? Transgender? Agender?
I'm nothing.
So here's the thing. Using the vampire as a trans allegory is an interesting study, but a bit of a double-edged sword. The title, Let the Right One In, is quoted from a Morrissey song, and it's of course alluding to the classic trope of the vampire needing to be invited in before entering places. This trope is part of Ely's vampire nature. If she enters without invitation, she begins bleeding from every pore in her body. The films show it like this. The book's title isn't about letting the vampire in at all. It's actually about who the vampire can choose to let in on her secret identity. Who can she trust to love her if they know the truth about what she is?
Would you still like me? Even if I wasn't a girl?
Ely's not a girl despite her appearance because she's a vampire, and in that sense, this does provide an allegory for transgender persons. But things get twisted around in the book when it's revealed that Eli's literally not a girl because she's actually secretly a boy. His real name's Elias, and his genitals were forcibly cut off by his vampire sire. He now chooses to present as female, but insists he's not. The damaging stigma against trans women in particular is that they are deceivers, that they are secretly gay men in dresses out to trick straight men into having sex with them. That trans women have a secret that they are not cis is an important matter that many struggle with in their daily lives and interactions with other people, often out of fear for their own safety. It is still legal in several states to use the gay panic defense as an excuse for murdering trans people. To compare this secret to a vampire's secret of appearing to be a normal, innocent person, but really being a monster, can be harmful for trans positivity if handled badly. But if done well, the metaphor can invoke feelings and themes trans people can relate to. Unfortunately, Lindqvist was not adept at handling it, and its inclusion in the book is one of the biggest problem areas. Both films chose to avoid dealing with it for the most part, which was for the best. The Swedish film shows a flash of Ely's scars, but leaves it entirely ambiguous for the audience, and most people who hadn't read the book weren't sure what to make of it. The American film makes her explicitly female. When she says this line,
I'm not a girl.
She is only speaking of being a vampire. They even filmed a flashback scene that didn't make it into the final cut showing her as a human girl. After the reveal of Ely's tragic backstory in the book, the pronouns switch from female to male in the text, and Ely thinks of himself in male terms from then on for the reader's benefit, despite still choosing to wear a dress. Once the human boy Oscar fully understands it, he starts using the male pronouns as well, and begins to explore the idea that he might be gay, because he is still interested in Ely. The fact that Ely chooses to present as female after it's no longer being forced upon her by the vampire who made her is what's problematic here. Ely was not trans as a human. No gender dysphoria, no questioning, just a very pretty boy. Perhaps gay, but not trans. Having genitalia cut off does nothing to change a person's gender. I can really only think of two reasons for why Ely would continue to choose to present as female, and neither of them are good. Either A, the author thought that she would be psychologically traumatized or something enough to become female. But if that's the case, why does she insist she's not? Besides, this isn't actually a thing that happens with real people. It's a common misconception that if someone is raised as a certain gender, they will feel they are that gender regardless of what they really are. But gender identity doesn't work that way. It's something that comes from within. And if Ely wasn't naturally trans already, it's not going to happen no matter how her body is changed. Hormones aren't even a factor in this case, as her growth was frozen before puberty. Besides just not being a real thing, this perpetuates another harmful falsehood that transgender people suffer from mental illness. And even if you're thinking, well, she's a vampire, this is fantasy, she's not real, so maybe it could have happened, it's still not helpful. The other possible explanation I've got is B. The author thought Ely would choose to continue to present as female as a way to trick people into thinking she was more innocent. It's easier for a little girl to get strangers to come close so she can then eat them alive, right? This brings us right back to that terrible trans women are men in dresses out to trick you stigma. Either Lindqvist was ignorant about trans issues or careless. That he treats Ely with such sympathy and depth as a character gives me hope that he's not consciously hateful of trans women. Perhaps he even thought he was being progressive and inclusive, but the ignorance and bigotry leaked through. So yeah, it's good the films avoided it. But there are so many other vampire themes that this book does explore well. Though both movies strip down the focus to the prepubescent sexless romance between the vampire Ely and the human Oscar, the book is balanced between them and a few other groups of characters. It's told from multiple points of view, bouncing among major recurring characters and minor ones who witness one event and then are never seen again. There's even one section from the point of view of a squirrel. This is Håkan. He's a much bigger character in the book than in the films. He's Ely's human slave and poses as her father. As a child vampire, she needs an adult to get by in the world. Besides renting her an apartment and protecting her during the day while she sleeps, his job is to collect blood so she can feed without putting herself in danger. Because, unlike fancy vampires who get victims swooning into their arms, every moment of the attack is a struggle for Ely against a thrashing, screaming victim. Håkan is hopelessly in love with her, willing to die to protect her, which he does. Both films intensely minimize his pedophilia, but in the book, it's explicit. He's a former teacher who was fired for possessing child pornography. He becomes a homeless alcoholic who Ely rescues off the streets. She gives him money in exchange for his help, but what he really wants is to have sex with her. As a pedophile attracted to 12-year-old boys, he's refrained from ever acting on his urges with any children in person, but he justifies his raging lust for Ely as he knows she's not actually a child, but much older. He's the child compared to her. Ely is not interested in sex, though, and refuses him. He's jealous of her friendship with Oscar, fearing he will be replaced. It's unclear how long they've been together, but at the start of the story, Håkan's only collected blood for her twice so far, so it can't have been very long. For a creepy murderer and pedophile, he is shockingly sympathetic in the book. He is racked with guilt and horror for his actions and is ultimately bumbling and inept. And the reader is on the edge of their seat, afraid he's going to get caught, even though we know he probably should. Perhaps he's even subconsciously self-sabotaging because he's not truly as evil as he needs to be. On his fourth attempt to collect blood, second we see in the story, he gets caught and disfigures himself with acid so the murders can't be traced back to Ely by anyone who might recognize him as her fake dad. Because pedophilia is avoided in the films, many people who watched the Swedish one assumed Håkan had been with Ely since he was a child, that they met the same way she met Oscar, and that Oscar was destined to become like him when he and Ely run away together at the end of the movie. The American film makes this interpretation canon by showing this picture of him as a boy with her, and he says this.
Maybe I'm just tired of this.
And then there are the thematic candies.
They're really good. They're my favorite. Eat some now, save some for later.
He sings the Now and Later jingle like 3 times in the film. Eat some now, save some for later. The vampire eats some people now, but she's saving him for later. Despite the sweet romantic tone of the way their relationship is presented in the film as an ironically adorable bright spot amid horror, he is doomed to repeat Håkan's cycle. A truly twisted and tragic ending that fits with the Romeo and Juliet parallels, but kinda undermines everything their innocent child romance was supposed to stand for. Lindqvist generally loved both films, but he did not like this part. So much so that he wrote a short story sequel that explicitly makes it clear that this is not what happens, nor what Ely and Oscar's relationship was ever about. In the sequel, this ticket-taker guy sees Ely transform Oscar into a vampire as soon as they get off the train after dark. Then, almost 30 years later, he sees a photo of them alive and well in Barcelona. A happy, sweet, romantic ending after all. And that's important, because Ely is a child vampire, and the fleetingness of youth and time and maturity are all big themes in the story. We get a lot of this with the group of alcoholic characters, but also with Oscar's immature father. He compares his dad to a werewolf whose monster emerges when he drinks. His father's neglect changes Oscar's perception of Ely. He goes from being afraid of her and wanting to run away to deciding she is the preferable monster. Unlike his dad and his utterly clueless, ineffectual mom, whose disconnection is conveyed in the American film by never showing her face clearly, Ely gives Oscar the attention and understanding he craves. Ely gets him, man! And that's because they're both kids. Dark, twisted, messed up kids, desperate to connect with someone. Håkon despairs as he sees Oscar bring out the child in Ely. She changes from being an aloof, ancient vampire to being actually happy because she's finally acting like the kid she truly is. Meanwhile, Oscar throws out his kiss poster, stops trying to pretend to like cool things that he's not actually into. He ironically becomes more mature by embracing his kidness. He becomes true to himself. It's implied Ely has never had a relationship with anyone like Oscar before, and they rescue each other from cold, lonely misery, which is totally symbolized by their environment here. And at the end of the story, they leave dark, cold, lonely Sweden for warm, bright places. The last line in the book is about the ticket taker, wondering how Oscar's going to carry the giant trunk that secretly contains Ely. Being happy with so much luggage is incomprehensible to him. Luggage, you know, like emotional baggage. But for a child, it's different, and things are going to be different for Ely with Oscar now. The cycle is broken. The Morrissey song the title's based on says, "Let the wrong ones go." Håkon could not truly understand or care for Ely. No adult could. She needs to let him go and let the right one in. Oscar is the right one. He has no sex drive yet and becomes frozen in his youth, so he will never want more from her the way Håkon did. In this universe, a person becomes a vampire if they're bitten and not killed immediately afterward, or mix their blood with a vampire's. Though they develop bloodlust that's very difficult to control, as well as superpowers and shape-shifting abilities, they retain their personality and conscience, to an extreme degree. Despite Ely's centuries of living, she's still emotionally and mentally 12. If a vampire is killed but not destroyed, then they become a true undead, a walking corpse driven by pure bloodlust and unrestrained desire. We get a couple examples in the book, but vampires are rare in this world because most mature adults who become one cannot endure the horror and guilt of having to slaughter people. Though Ely usually kills people before they can transform, she's interrupted when she bites Virginia. So in Virginia, we get to experience the difference between her mentality and Ely's. Virginia realizes that she must lose everyone and everything she loves because of her new monstrous nature, and she chooses to destroy herself. We get to spend a lot more time with Virginia in the book. The Swedish film still includes her decision, but the American one misses the point entirely by giving her no struggle and making her immolation an accident for the sake of gory effects.
I've been told for a very long time.
But as a child vampire, perhaps Ely has an underdeveloped sense of empathy, or simply is too naive to comprehend the horror of her nature in a way that affects her conscience. Her concern isn't about being a bad person for moral reasons, but about other people rejecting her, what they think. Even though Oscar is also only a child, obsessed with serial killers and enjoys pretending to murder the kids who bully him at school, he's not so morally lacking that he's okay with Ely killing people. At least not right away. But she turns it around on him. To her mind, he is more evil than she is because Oscar wants to kill people, even if he doesn't actually do it. Ely has no choice, has to do it to live, but doesn't want to the same way he does. Gradually, the moralities come together until they meet in the middle when she kills his bullies for revenge and he becomes a vampire who needs blood to live as well. And the audience is left rooting for these murderers. This famous pool scene is one great thing the film's added, by the way. It's all off screen in the book, and we only find out what happened in a police report later. Both films have this scene, but it's much more effective in the Swedish one because that movie is coy with the gore before this point. The American movie has so much blood that this scene doesn't hit anywhere close to his heart. Oscar, Ely, and the bully's violence are all contrasted with Håkon's motivation for murder, which is love. Lust. Love. They're the same thing to him. One of the biggest things the films don't include is the second half of Håkon's story. After he disfigures himself with acid, Ely sneaks to his hospital window and drinks his blood. But before she can kill him, they're interrupted and she flees. He goes out the window, but it's too late. He's already a vampire. So then, he's a dead vampire, a true undead, the walking mindless corpse driven by bloodlust and, in his case, actual lust. And it's especially horrifying considering he looks like this as he shambles through the countryside, striking terror into the population, wearing nothing but a tattered hospital gown with a permanent erection sticking out. His vampire death isn't the only one that's framed as sexual. In the book, as Virginia explodes into flame, it's described how her hospital gown rides up to reveal her genitals, and she writhes and thrusts like she's copulating with some invisible being. This conflation of sex with the predatory nature of the vampires, classic. But to contrast it with the masses of alluring vampires, the book makes the connection one of pure, repulsive horror. For whatever that's worth. Undead Hoken hunts down Ely and tries to rape her, but she escapes and traps him in the basement with a character, Tommy, who's not in the films. Tommy is 16 and lives in Oscar's building and is kind of his friend. He has a whole life and plot of his own going on in the book that also has to do with failed parenting and repression and emotional trauma. Tommy serves as a tragic glimpse of what Oscar's life was destined to become if Ely hadn't helped him escape that fate. Now, Ely doesn't know Tommy's in the room when she traps Hoken, but the reader does, and this scene is one of the scariest scenes I've ever read in a book. Oh my god, I can't believe they cut this out of the films. And there's so much else, like the xenophobia themes regarding the Russian submarine that comes to their shores, the foreign nuclear threat contrasted with the vampire that moves in next door, the fact that Ely translates to God, and when Hoken calls out Ely's name before throwing acid on his face, it mirrors Christ's last words on the cross. He truly worships her and the statements that makes on religious practices. E-L-I. God. Same reason why people keep giving Dracula dead wives name some variation of Elizabeth, which is an awesome name. The American film changes her name to Abby, which comes from Abba, which translates to father, which is also a word for God. The parallels of the vampire not having control over her own body to Oscar's incontinence and Hoken's lust. The way Ely wastes away without blood, mirrored in how the drunks are wasting away. How Tommy's dad wasted away, how our lives are wasting away each moment we're not being true to our natures. Yeah, I could probably talk about this book for hours, but the night beckons, so I'm cutting myself off. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and this was a heavy review. Would you like to hear a joke? Knock, knock. Who's there? Ivan. Ivan who? I want to suck your blood, so let me in! It never works.
Let the right one in, let the old dreams die, let the wrong ones go, they do not.
Do you think if I just put a sign on my door that said vampires always welcome, they wouldn't have to ask to come in, and they could just come in whenever they wanted and sweep me off my feet and join my Patreon and follow me on Twitter and follow me on Facebook and like and subscribe and leave me comments? You could do that if you're not a vampire too. That's okay.